By the end of this lesson and practice periods, you will know information that is worth being familiar with. You may not use all of these techniques all the time, but they will come in handy when trying to achieve specific watercolor techniques. In this lesson, you will learn a variety of techniques that can be used to achieve special effects in your watercolor paintings. I've started off by dividing my sheet into 18 different sections, and each section I will fill it with a different watercolor technique. All of these techniques are simple to do, and you can achieve a variety of really unique looks using a variety of household supplies like rubbing alcohol and salt. The first technique we learned about in lesson number 2. It's a wash, which is a semi-transparent layer of paint going over the entire surface of an area. Washes are great for creating an interesting background for your paintings. You can blend multiple hues or colors into a wash in order to create a more dynamic background. Next is our graded or graduated wash, which starts out very vibrant and fades. This technique is achieved by using water to pull the color down. The paint and water work together to slowly blend the color and achieve the fading look. In a variegated wash, we're doing a similar technique as the graded wash, but we're using 2 different colors and blending them together. It's best to stick to either warm or cool colors when doing this technique. Otherwise, you might just end up with a brown mess. The next 2 techniques involve blocking, or stopping the paint from going onto a particular area of the paper. We'll start off by using a white crayon, and then in the next section I'll use some masking fluid. Masking fluid gets painted onto the paper. We'll come back to it as it needs to be thoroughly dry before we add in the paint. Next, I'll show you the lifting or blotting technique. Watercolor is a very forgiving medium, which means if you accidentally drop a little bit of paint onto your paper, you can easily soak it up using this technique. All you need is a dry sponge or paper towel, and then press it into the paint to soak up the moisture and color. This technique is especially great for creating natural looking clouds. Next is one of my favorite techniques. I'm going to start off by putting a thick wash over the paper with a bunch of different colors. You'll notice I'm still sticking to only cool colors. I then take some saran wrap, place it over the wet paint, and kind of play around with it. You don't have a lot of control over where this goes, but we're going to leave it on and wait and see what it looks like once it dries. Next, we're going to use salt to create an interesting pattern. I'm going to start off by putting a wash on, and then I'll simply sprinkle some table salt into the wet area. The tricky part of this technique is that the salt is always going to interact differently with different amounts of water and also with different pigment types. So you really just have to play around with the technique to figure out what works and what doesn't. We'll come back once it's dry to take a look at it. In this next technique, I start out once again putting a wash over my paper. I will then use a paintbrush to drop some rubbing alcohol right into the wet paint. It creates this really cool, bubbly, swirly effect. For this next one, we're going to create a wash, which will give us a wet base, and then we're going to drip and splatter some wet paint into the wet base. Similarly, we can apply a wash and then drip little droplets of water into our wet base. For the next technique, we need a dry base. So I've already added a wash to this section and let it dry completely. This is called layering, and we simply layer wet paint on top of dry paint. Thirsty brush is a correction technique used when you get a little overzealous and add too much water to your painting. Simply get a clean dry brush and place it on the edge of your puddle. Let the bristles slowly soak up that water into the brush. You can also use a sponge or piece of paper towel to soak up the water in a similar fashion. Next, we have another correction technique called edge softening. If the dry paint is a little bit too sharp, you can always soften up the edges and make them a little fuzzy by adding water over top of the wet paint. This thins out the paint and gives you sort of a blurrier edge. You can even soften up the whole thing by just applying water over top of any dry portion of your painting. Straw blowing is a really fun but totally unpredictable technique. Do not do this over a brilliant masterpiece. You're going to start off by just putting some drops of wet paint on your paintbrush and then using a straw to blow them in a sporadic direction. For our next three techniques, we're going to add some different mediums. The first medium we're going to use is called India ink, and we will be applying it to both wet and dry paint. As you can see, the wet versus dry factor changes this medium considerably. And finally, we're going to use some acrylic paint over top of our dry watercolor wash. Now let's go back up to our blocked sections to see what they look like. Our white crayon is very simple to use, whereas the masking fluid takes a little bit of time to dry. In fact, after applying the paint over top of the masking fluid, we have to wait yet again before we can remove the masking fluid. Now that everything is dry, we can go ahead and remove the saran wrap. How cool is that technique? It reminds me of ice or glaciers. Now moving on to the masking fluid, we're actually going to peel it off. It's sort of a rubbery texture and it comes off very easily. Let's take a closer look now that each section is dry. Here are our washes, white crayon, masking fluid, lifting or blotting, plastic wrap, salt, rubbing alcohol, dripping and splattering paint, dripping and splattering water, layering, thirsty brush, edge softening, straw blowing, India ink on wet, India ink on dry, and acrylic paint on dry. Here is also a more dramatic example of what the salt effect can look like. Now it's your turn to test out these watercolor techniques.